Jewish mysticism in it. So it's very far afield of a halacha shir that we're. Yeah, I mean, it's a great sefer, but it really is not consistent with what the objective of the shir is, which is to study halacha. But I appreciate the. Okay. There we go. All right, so what we were discussing yesterday is we're trying to get a handle on the halacha that you have to give someone de machsoro, whatever they're lacking. And yet at the same time, so de machsoro, from one standpoint, is where we saw in the Gemara, it says you have to give him what he's lacking, but you're not obligated to enrich him. But in the same breath, the Gemara had said that you have to provide a poor person who was used to a certain particular standard, you have to provide him with whatever he's used to living with. So that was where we got into this shaila about a fellow who had gotten into the habit of using a car, and then he sold his car. Is he allowed to use the tzedakah money to buy himself a replacement vehicle? Even when, there are some people in Kollel who don't have their own car, some people in Kollel who do have their own car. So what would you say? So he says, "V'inei b'shita mikubetzes kasav azeloshana afilu sus lirkov alav." He writes that even if you even have to provide, the Gemara had said, you even have to provide a poor man a horse and a runner's servant, if that's what he was used to. So v'davka ba'asher shiyorad min achasav shehu murgal mitchila betanugim gedolim. So the Shita Mikubetzis writes, this is referring to if a person was quite wealthy and then had a reversal of fortune all of a sudden, and now needs to rely on charity. That's where you have to buy him this horse and a runner's servant. But with other poor people who were never accustomed to this kind of standard of living, you're not obligated. So remember, we saw the story in the Gemara in Ksubis that had said that a certain rabbi, I think it was Rav Nachman, I don't remember, but a fellow came to him and said that he was used to having a horse and a runner. And one day he couldn't find a runner, so he himself ran before this guy for three mil. Harei shebechol zeh shelagabi misha hitragel besus v'chein bechol motarot zeh nachshav bishvilo de machsaro. So you see that if a person was accustomed to these sort of luxuries, then that's called his filling his lack or filling his needs. But it seems like he has to have grown up with this, is what the language implies. The Maharsha similarly writes, that it's something that he grew up with in his family home. And the chiddush is that you can't make a judgment call that a person who is fastidious doesn't need to be fastidious. Because what was that story that we saw? The guy who ate the lentils instead of eating the fatted meat. He just died because his stomach couldn't tolerate it. Ulam b'Gemara Isa hahuda asa lekami de Rebbe Nechemya. So we know that the Gemara, and he brings the story that we learned yesterday. A man came before Rebbe Nechemya. Amar le bamea tasoed. So he said to him, "What are you used to eating? Well, what's your regular meal?" Amar le bebasar shamein v'yayin yashan. He says, "I usually have this fatted meat and aged wine." Ritzoncha shetigalgel imi ba'adashim, gilgel imo ba'adashim v'amet. So he invited him to dine with him on his regular lentil meal. The guy sat down for some lentils and died. Amar oy lo lazeh shohargo Nechemya. So Rabbi Nechemya said, "Woe is this poor man who Nechemya has killed," speaking about himself. So Adarabba oy lo Nechemya shohargo lazeh miboyle. The Gemara says he should have lamented himself for having killed the man. The Gemara says the reason why Rabbi Nechemia said, "Woe is this man who was killed by Nechemia," is because he was lamenting that some people get themselves into such a lifestyle that they become so fastidious that they cannot tolerate regular people's life. You know, they get accustomed to such standards that if they do have a reversal in fortune and they're required to live a little bit, less high on the horse, then they can't tolerate it and life is miserable for them, even to the point of death. So so the fact that Rabbi Nechemia was able to make that statement that he's really partially at fault because he should not have gotten accustomed to such an opulent lifestyle. Nira dedavka misha posha b'hanhagas atzmo b'hisragel b'motzaros az hamotzaros lo nechshavos b'shvilu l'dei machzora. So it seems like only if someone allowed themselves to elevate their living standard to a point where they couldn't tolerate lentils anymore, that's where the Gemara feels that you're not obligated to give them more. But if a person did not allow themselves to enter into such a luxurious habit, but rather they found themselves in a situation where they needed to live with certain amenities, that's not that for that person is what he lacks. Im hitragel yishtamesh berechev ki hayanachos lo harechev letzarach avodato shuv havi bishvilo dei machzero kibin shelo pasha ba'atzmo. The argument the author wishes to make is as follows: when you are used to certain luxuries that there's really there was no need for you to to indulge in those luxuries. You just happen to have a lot of money, so you decided that why not partake if I can afford it. So that's one kind of luxury. Then there's another kind of luxury where you take a job and for the needs of your parnasa, you have to drive a fancy car or you have to wear expensive clothes because that's what the job description requires of you. You're a salesman, and so you need to wear a certain kind of clothing in order to be able to impress your customers. Or you need a vehicle so that and it's got to be a nice vehicle so that when you pull up to a client, they'll be impressed. Okay? There, the argument is that this is not at all the fault of the person who became used to this kind of lifestyle, because it was for him a necessity so that he could make a parnasa. So the argument that he wants to make is there's a difference between getting into the habit of eating fatty meat and drinking aged wine versus having a car. Because having a car is not considered a luxury if you're a working man and you have to commute to work. Okay? And so therefore, the imkain, masha kosav maharsha hanal dahainu shuhurgol bekach eitzel avosov lavdavka, ela rotzalomer kamosha mishu hurgol eitzel avosov lo pasha ba'atzmo v'nechshav bishvilu l'dei machzaro. So therefore, we have to conclude that even though the Maharsha's statement was you grew up with this in your family home, let's say you didn't grow up with it in your family home. Let's say you became used to a luxurious lifestyle after you left home. That would still be the halacha, provided that that you're entitled to revert back to that lifestyle, even as a person collecting tzedakah, provided hu adin l'chol mishi hitragel b'motarot shelo b'derech shel pshia ela shaya muchrach ot tzarich. But rather, you got used to certain amenities in your life because that was necessary to maintain your level of living. So because of livelihood. So that's a distinction that he wishes to draw. And he wants to make the same diak from the Meiri as well, which we're not going to go into now. Let me just finish this off with the third point. He says, the Meiri actually had also written, based on this Gemara with Rabbi Nehemiah, that even though you have to try and provide for a person his needs, you're not obligated to give him more than what your standard of living is. In other words, even if a person is used to living a luxurious lifestyle, if you have the means to give them tzedakah, you're not obligated to give them more than your standard of living. So that's another criterion that is worth noting, because I think I might have told you, I mentioned it in my Pirkei Avos class. This gentleman, Dave Gold, was the owner of the 99 cents only stores on the West Coast, which was the start of these dollar stores, worldwide. So he was a Yid. And so the way I got to meet him and know him a little bit was because one of the members of my shul in LA did closeouts and would sell things to the 99 cents only stores. And he asked if I would help this guy sell his chametz for all the 99 cent stores, all of them, all couple of hundred stores, however many there were. And so we did, but it was fascinating is that Dave Gold lived in a small house that he had lived in since the 1950s, and he drove a car that he had driven since the 1960s, even though he was worth billions of dollars. Yeah, Warren Buffett, they say, is the exact same way, right? So a guy comes to Warren Buffett and asks for tzedakah, or to Dave Gold and asks for tzedakah. So Dave Gold can say to him, I know that you're used to having fancy cars and things like that, and I'm sorry for your reversal in fortune, but I'm not going to pay for your car. I'll give you what you need in order to have food. And here, when I have dinner at home, I go to the 99 cents only store. I find a box of mac and cheese and I bring it home, and that's what we have for dinner, and that's what I can provide for you as well. So she'ein chiyuv latet yoter mimashu hu lokech la'atzmo. Lefi zeh keben shechelek mehatzibur shetorim lekupa einam machzikim rechev memela einam chayavim latet avur rechev lemishu hergal bazeh. As far as, so we were looking first at the perspective of the ani. Can the ani use his tzedakah money to buy a car? And it seems that if that's what he had become accustomed to, not because of just stam indulgence, but because he needed it, that would be justification. However, looking at it from the perspective of the donor base, if the donor base is comprised of some people own cars and some people don't own cars, because let's say the donor base are also people who are in Kollel, or a large percentage of the community, and they're donating to that cause, they're not obligated to donate so much to that individual so that he can afford to drive a car. Ula mimasha kosav ha'meiri shelo hayalo lahargil atzmo lehit anegal kach mashma shediber dafka kishehitragel betanug mugzam. But at the same time, the Meiri is only gives that dispensation that you don't have to support his luxury if the person should not have learned to indulge in that kind of luxury. But if he had gotten into the habit of indulging in a luxury that a large percentage of the congregation of the community indulges in, so therefore maybe you could argue that the community does have an obligation to support him, because he wasn't negligent in getting himself accustomed to some frivolous luxury. He got himself in the custom of driving a car, which he needed for his parnasa. V'imkein karav lomar shegam mishalo hitragel berechav mibeit avotav ela bizman shaya matzav tov Mikol makom ata shehu ani yeh mutar lo lahachzik b'rechev keven shelo pasha. And therefore, in conclusion, even though there's room to equivocate on this shaila, because the community may not have an obligation to support him at a standard that's higher than their own, but since the standard that he became accustomed to was not frivolous or gratuitous, but it was rather something that he needed for his parnasa, it could be that his being accustomed to that luxury should still be supported by the community. And that's how he ends it. In other words, he does, at the end of the day, have a right to argue that I need a car because I consider that my basic essential. But there also might be room for the community to say, that's not what a lot of us are used to supporting, and therefore we're not going to support it. But on the other hand, there could be room for them to say, yes, we will support it, because the fact that you became accustomed to it was not because of some frivolous thing like getting used to fatty meat, but rather because it was something that was considered essential for you. It's based on the communal standards. Today, so like I gave the example of the dirt floor yesterday, a guy says he needs a new floor for his house. So you can't say, well, I remember in Europe 100 years ago, a lot of people had dirt floors, right? They even say the story about the Chafetz Chaim. His second wife was used to a higher standard of living than his first wife. So when they got married, she said, I don't want to live in a house with dirt floors. And she mentioned this numerous times to her new husband until finally he agreed that he would buy a wood floor. But once they installed the wood floor, she saw that he was unhappy. And she said, why are you so unhappy? He said, because every time I look at the floor, all I see are pages of Gemara. In other words, he was saying that if I had to take away time from my learning in order to be able to earn enough to be able to afford the floor, I see all the pages of Gemara that I was not able to learn because of this wooden floor. So you see that, it was considered to be a luxury back then. But if someone came to you and says, can you help me install a floor in my house? Otherwise, I'm just going to have the dirt to walk on. You can't say, well, that's a luxury because 100 years ago, the Chafetz Chaim in Poland didn't have a wooden floor. That would not be a legitimate argument. We'd have to support that person because everyone in our community has wood floors or some flooring of some kind. Maybe it doesn't have to be hardwood, but it could be laminate or whatever they call Okay. Anything else before we go on? It seems like in the conclusion is that if a person became accustomed to a certain standard of living that was frivolous, in other words, he was eating meat every day and he couldn't tolerate lentils, you're not obligated to support that habit. But if he became accustomed to a certain standard of living that he needed for the sake of his parnasa, he is entitled to be supported with that standard.
I have a question in terms of, so I guess it comes down to the type of car. Assume he needs a car. They can get him help him buy a pre-owned car as opposed to a luxury car.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I would think so, as long as it's something that is, yeah. I'll tell you, one of the things, in LA is that a lot of people live quite luxuriously, right? So, and people do the same in Toronto. It's not like such a stark difference. But there is a nonprofit organization where the fundraisers are very successful, raising money from celebrities and things like that. And I used to see them every day at this expensive restaurant having lunch because they would take out their potential prospective donors for lunch. Now, could that person say, well, I can justify using the charity's funds to go out to lunch every day to this expensive restaurant because that's what I'm used to. That's my standard of living, that I go to lunch to this place every day. it always bothered me, because it's one thing to take out your donors to an expensive restaurant. You need to impress them and wine them and dine them. But let's say you're not at lunch with a donor, but you just became accustomed to that. I felt that this was a frivolous use of the charity's money, because they were always billing it to the. I assume they were billing it to the company account. Anyway, so okay. Yeah, you probably have to take a median of the community, I would assume. And also you have to look at what that person's standard was before they became reliant on charity, provided that it's not a frivolous luxury. Yeah. Yep. Mhm. Okay. Let's go on to the next she'ela. Shimon nosein es kol ha'maser shelo lekrovo Levi, azokuk le'ezer ledvarim hecharechiyim. Shimon is giving all of his meiser money to his relative Levi. And Levi is a poor man, and he's quite dependent upon tzedakah, meaning that he needs his basic essentials. Ein l'Shimon krovim acherim aniyim. And this is the only poor relative that Shimon has. Hayim hu noheg kiroi, o dilma hu chayav lateit chelek mahamaiser shalo, gam l'sha'ar aniyim. Is Shimon behaving correctly by giving all of his tzedakah money to his relative, or should he give only a portion of his tzedakah money to his relative and distribute the rest of his tzedakah money to other poor people? So when we know that giving to a relative is a higher priority than giving to a neighbor or someone else that you're not related to, but is it to the exclusion of all else, is really the question? Or are you supposed to try and give a large portion of your meiser to your relative, but give the rest to other people as well? We have this situation quite often when, let's say, a man is trying to support one of his children who is poor. They don't have money. And the excuse that he gives, or his divorced sister-in-law or sister, and the argument goes, he says, look, I have to give all of the tzedakah that I have to this relative because she's going through a hard time, and so therefore I can't give to anybody else. Is that a correct argument? Or is it more correct to say, I'll give her a certain amount, she'll have to go to other people for the rest of her needs, and because I want to give it to other charities? Like, which one is the correct attitude to take? So his response is, Asur latet kol masrotav lekarov echad ulahaniach shar karovim. So the first halacha is, if you have multiple relatives who could benefit from your meiser, you can't give just to one and exclude the others. You're also not allowed to give all of your tzedakah to one poor person and leave the others empty-handed. In other words, what you're supposed to try and do is to be equitable in distributing your tzedakah to as many poor people as you can. Aval mutar latet hakol lekama krovim ulahaniach shar aniyim. But what you are permitted to do is to give all of your tzedakah to just relatives and to forsake the other poor in the community. That you are allowed to do. He says, and similarly, if you have only one relative who's poor, you can give him all of your tzedakah money and forsake all of the other poor in the community. V'zeh me'ikar hadin. But that's only according to the letter of the law. But the spirit of the law would require a person to give half of his funds to his relative and his other half to the other poor that are in the community. So where does this come from? That's the question. Where does he get this from? But let's read this. Lefi zeh b'nidon dinan Shimon Rishai latet et kol hamaser shelo likrovo ulam yoter nachon lechalek chatzi l'sharnim. So therefore, in the case that was presented, Shimon would be justified in giving all of his meiser to Reuven, his relative, but it would be more proper, perhaps, for him to distribute some, to leave over a sum, what he says is half of his meiser to give to other poor people, and to only give to Reuven half of his meiser money. And so essentially what the psak that he's providing is that even though he's justified if he wants to argue that he doesn't have any more money to give to the poor of the community, he can make that argument, but it would be more proper for him. In other words, essentially the community can't demand that he make distributions to other poor people, even though he may have significant wealth, if he comes back with the excuse that I'm supporting half of my wife's family, which I've actually heard that argument. You know, I married a girl, her family doesn't have a lot of money, her siblings are ne'er-do-wells, and I end up having to support 3 different families from my wife's side because that drains out all of my tzedakah money. I'm paying for 3 tuitions, 4 college tuitions, this, that, got to save my brother-in-law from the foreclosure. I'm sure you've all heard these kinds of stories, and so he can excuse himself and say, listen, I'm tapped out, not because I've been given a lot to the community needs, but because now it could even be that a person like that could maybe even ask the shul for a reduction in his membership, saying, the shul says, well, let's see your T4s. And he shows him his T4s. He made $500,000 that year. How can you ask for a reduction in membership? So he would come back to them and say, because I'm supporting 3 families with $500,000. That's not enough to support 3 families. And so sometimes that could be a valid argument, right? So let's take a look at the sources. Oh, I better plug in my computer. My battery is running low. So what are the sources? He says, Hinei b'shulchan aruch kosa b'zel shana. The Shulchan Aruch writes that lo yitain adam kol tzidkosav la'ani echad bilvad. Shulchan Aruch says that it is not appropriate to give all your charity to one poor person. Shach says, similarly, if you have multiple relatives who are poor, you shouldn't give all your money to one relative and forsake all of the other relatives. Let's see if that does the trick. Yeah. Okay. And forsake all of the other relatives. And all the Shach was doing was citing from an earlier commentary. He says, so therefore the objection when a person is, disproportionately giving to one person over the others is if he's exclusively giving to one relative over to the exclusion of all the other relatives. But you would be allowed to, because there's a hierarchy of distribution. Your relatives take priority over other poor people, and therefore you would be justified in giving, let's say, all of your tzedakah just to your relatives, as long as you're equitable among your relatives, and forsaking all of the other non-relative poor. Umashma gam kein shim ein lo ela karov ani echad muter late lo kol masrotav lo aniach shar aniyim. And therefore, based on that language, it sounds that it's justifiable to give all of your tzedakah money to just one relative who's poor, if that's he's your only relative, and not to give to the other poor in the community. And this is where we'll hold it for today. We'll explore this a little bit more later.